So I'd like to welcome everyone here to our Just Universities Practicing Solidarity in Difficult Times event. My name is Aaron Willis. I'm director of the Bannon Forum and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here at Santa Clara University. And I'd like to thank Dr. Gerald Beyer and Dr. Julie Hanlon-Rubio for engaging in this conversation today. And a special thanks really to Julie for being the person who kind of conceived of this event and brought it to fruition. When she suggested it, I was really excited to be able to help sponsor this conversation because it speaks to many of the pressing issues we face today in higher education, and also to the animating question behind the work of the Bannon Forum, which is really, what does it mean to be a Jesuit Catholic university in this time and place? And so I'm really looking forward to today's conversation and happy we could make this happen. And so with that, I'd like to, and I'm happy to introduce Father Kevin O'Brien, president of Santa Clara University, to offer some words of welcome.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks very much. And it's wonderful to be with all of you today for this really animating conversation. Just a reminder about all the good work that the Bannon Forum does under Aaron's leadership. As many probably on this call know, having participated in the forum invites faculty to engage the depth and the breadth of the Catholic intellectual tradition and to understand how that tradition comes alive as we grow as persons and as a community today. And part of that rich tradition is Catholic social thought, a body of principles developed particularly in about the last 130 years as the Catholic Church engaged the modern world. Now, the corpus of Catholic social teaching covers a whole range of issues and continues to expand today as we grow in our understanding of ourselves and our world and who we are before God. And given the breadth of the principles, that tradition underscores the need to cultivate prudence, which is a virtue or habit of the mind and heart that helps us apply principles to particular situations. And here is where we might disagree in our approach or how we prioritize competing values. And so we welcome conversations on topics that challenge us because we are confident that we can lean on our shared commitment to those larger principles as a community here. And that's why pairing justice with reconciliation is so vital. This is a priority that the Jesuits around the world have been emphasizing for the last few years, especially pairing justice with reconciliation. This allows us to build a culture of truth, but also a culture of generous encounter that finds ways to talk to one another in a spirit of both kinship and humility. So I'm looking forward very much to our conversation, to learning and with all of you and to listening. So I'm so grateful that Jerry Beyer is here. I'm grateful to Julie Rubio, a Bannon Fellow and my former colleague up at the Jesuit School of Theology. She is a professor of Christian ethics who has written extensively on the vibrancy of the Catholic intellectual tradition and Catholic social thought and how to find common ground amid the disagreements we have within the church or within our body politic. So Julie, thanks for inviting us to this really engaging conversation today.
Thanks so much, President O'Brien, for being here. I'm grateful for that. I think it signals Santa Clara's willingness to really rigorously engage Catholic social thought and its prophetic implications for our life together in the university. I am really excited to welcome my colleague, Dr. Gerald Beyer from Villanova University. He's Associate Professor of Ethics there. He has just, almost published, right? Almost coming, the book is almost out, Just Universities, Catholic Social Thought, Confronting Corporatized Higher Education. It has been 10 years in the making, and this book arguably establishes him as the national expert on that topic. So he comes to us with a deep knowledge of solidarity, going back to St. John Paul II and the Polish Solidarity movement, as well as a history of participation in Catholic Scholars for Worker Justice and other advocacy organizations. I have been lucky to see him speak at other universities, including St. Louis University, where I came from a couple of years ago. And I can tell you that he's deeply respected in my field of Christian ethics, especially importantly by our non-tenure track colleagues. He is on the ground, he's done his research, he understands the conversation, he's fair, he's honest, and he comes to this work out of love. And I'm so happy that he agreed to be here with us at Santa Clara as we face so many of the issues that he deals with in his book, issues of diversity and inclusion and labor justice, admissions, Jesuit and Catholic identity and mission. So what we're going to do is have a bit of a conversation. No fireplace is needed here in Northern California today. Maybe back in Philly, but we'll do a chat anyway, and we'll have some back and forth for about 20 minutes, and then open it up to questions. So Jerry, in the introduction of your book, you say, "I don't relish writing this book." Can you talk about what originally inspired you to write it anyway?
Thank you, Julie. Thanks to all of you, Father O'Brien, Father Kevin O'Brien, and Aaron Willis of the Bannon Forum, and you, Julie, for having me virtually, at least on your campus today. I wish I were with you. The weather is obviously a lot nicer than frigid Philadelphia, which is about 30 degrees for a high today. So this book, which actually is out at this point, finally, after about 10 years of work on it, with Fordham University Press. It's a book that's been a long time coming. And as I say, and as you mentioned, I didn't really relish writing this book. I certainly didn't predict I would write this book before undertaking it. So I had been working for quite some time on the Polish Solidarity movement, as you alluded to. I did my dissertation on Solidarność, spent a number of years in Poland. And when I got to my first job in Philadelphia, at a Jesuit university, I started to see what I perceived to be contradictions between Catholic social teaching, the principles of Catholic social teaching, and realities on the ground. And I'll say more about that in due course. But what I want to say to start is that a couple of things. First, I want to stress that these are obviously very complicated issues. Applying Father O'Brien rightly mentioned the virtue of prudence. Applying the principles of Catholic social teaching to these very complex realities that we face at our institutions is a tall order. And so I want to be sure to stress, I don't pretend to know all the answers. I mentioned that in the introduction to the book. This book is meant to be a conversation starter in places where perhaps some conversations have not yet begun around the issues I raise in the book, or to contribute to conversations that are already going on. So I want to, in a sort of gesture of epistemological humility, perhaps say that, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'm happy to be told that maybe there are things that I don't quite understand, that I need to see from other perspectives. That's a priori going into this work. I understood that. So having said that, I did undertake the work, as I said, because I perceived contradictions between principles of Catholic social teaching, such as solidarity, human dignity and human rights, the option for the poor, the common good, and, for example, treatment of adjunct faculty, where I would encounter colleagues who couldn't get necessary healthcare treatment because they didn't have health insurance. Their employer didn't make healthcare affordable for them. In addition, I've had a longstanding interest in access to higher education. So I myself am a first gen. I like to mention that. I mention that partially as a debt of gratitude. I was lucky enough to be able to attend Georgetown University on a full scholarship. My parents' EFC after filling out the FAFSA was literally zero. For those of you who are familiar with estimated family contributions. And so this was an incredible blessing for me to be able to go to an institution like Georgetown. And as I mentioned in the book, I was able to attend Jesuit a Jesuit undergraduate institution, Boston College, for my doctoral degree on a fellowship. And I also had a scholarship going back to St. Joseph's Prep in my high school days. So I have a very heavy debt that I owe to Catholic institutions, and in particular Jesuit institutions. I have a love for Jesuit education and a love for Catholic higher education. So the critiques that I offer in the book are born out of that love. They are my own effort, imperfect as it may be, to contribute to our institutions becoming all that they are called to be, to striving to ever greater approximate commitment to justice, solidarity, and the common good. So that's really why I undertook this book. I want to say also that I'm sure there are examples, positive examples, that I missed in my research. So I apologize to anyone out there whose institution maybe is left out of the book, who might say, hey, wait a minute, well, we're doing really well in this regard. I know that I overlooked positive examples and perhaps negative examples. So I try the examples, the cases that I use are meant to be illustrative of both positive trends and unfortunately examples where I feel that Catholic social teaching is not being embodied in the way that it should.
Thanks. I appreciate your coming both from love for the institutions as well as obligation to those who you've seen suffer, and to the problem of contradiction that you feel compelled to work out, especially as we've talked about the privilege that comes with being among the minority of tenured faculty. But I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about sort of why CST. So corporatized higher ed, we'll talk about in a minute, but CST is the frame for the book and for the conversation. We know that fewer and fewer students, and maybe in a lot of places, faculty and staff in Catholic universities identify as Catholic, and maybe even those who are less churched. In Jesuit universities, as you probably remember, we're often more comfortable talking about Jesuit identity than Catholic identity. And so it seems like maybe there's an argument for using language that might be more widely shared and maybe not particularly Catholic, especially today. So why center CST in this context?
Thank you, Julie. So that's an important question, one that I pondered and continue to ponder, and I had tried to address it in the book in the initial chapter. So I apologize if my answers aren't adequate tonight. Hopefully I've done a better job of articulating my perspectives in the book. But in any event, I certainly understand that our institutions, meaning our colleges and universities, are comprised of diverse student bodies, diverse faculty members and staff. And when I say diverse, I mean diversity of all sorts, including religious diversity. And I welcome that. Rightly so, our institutions are diverse. I think many of us, myself included, would agree that the diversity, the religious and other types of diversity that we share, make our institutions stronger and enable us to better pursue the truth together in community, because we can learn, as papal teaching, Catholic teaching has said, about our own tradition in dialogue with members of other traditions, faith traditions and secular traditions. And as a scholar of Catholic social thought and the Catholic tradition more broadly, the Catholic tradition has learned from other strands of thought throughout its entire history, right? It's been in dialogue with and has appropriated elements of other traditions. We know, for example, about the understanding of justice in Catholic social thought. It's not something original, right? It goes back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and elsewhere. So having said that, to go back to the locus of our conversation, namely the university, while I appreciate that diversity and welcome it, as a Catholic Jesuit institution, or as a Catholic institution more broadly, it is important for us to understand that our institutions are called, by virtue of being Catholic and Jesuit, if we're talking about a Catholic Jesuit institution, They are called by virtue of their mission and their identity to embody Catholic social teachings principles. Those principles, it's been said over and over again by recent popes. For example, Pope John Paul II saying, the church and its magisterium understands that Catholic social teaching will be better learned and appropriated when people see it embodied, right? So being faithful to embodying fidelity to the principles of Catholic social teaching is actually part of the teaching function that relates to Catholic social teaching, if that makes sense. In other words, to put it in simple terms, and I mentioned, a conversation I had, lots of my thinking, by the way, is animated by and informed by conversations I've had with either students or colleagues on my own campuses or elsewhere. And I remember a really bright student once saying to me, we had a class together, and he said, Professor Beyer, I really enjoyed learning about Catholic social teaching, but if it's not being embodied, even in our own church-related institutions, what's the point? What's the point? So we're talking about a matter of credibility, witnessing to the Catholic social tradition. The USCCB, United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, has stated that Catholic institutions of higher education must teach the principles of Catholic social teaching, and I argue we must embody them in order to teach them successfully, effectively. Because as my students said to me in conversation, it's not enough to say, do as I say, not what I do. So I could say more about that if you like, but that's more or less where I'm coming from, that it's a matter of fidelity, witnessing to the church's social tradition. In order for it to be effective in the world and making a difference in the world, we have to try to model it. I remember, and I quoted him in this book, the late William Spone, the great Catholic ethicist, who talks about the formation of consciences, that we don't learn the principles and values that we adopt and embrace by simply reading about them. We learn them by seeing them embodied. So that applies both to individuals as moral exemplars and institutions.
Right. So Catholic social thought is something that we have to embody as an institution, and yet when you identify corporatized higher ed as the thing that we have to confront, I was thinking, I don't know many people at Catholic universities who say I'm a big fan of corporatized higher ed, right? It's kind of like who's against justice, right? Or who doesn't oppose injustice. And yet it seems like it is so hard for us to resist this, even if we oppose it in theory.
Mhm.
On the ground. So I know that's a big question, but can you begin to talk about why this has become so hard to resist, even when our hearts are in the right place?
Yeah, this is certainly a vexing and difficult issue. Let me just say before I delve into that question that I also stress in the book, Catholic social teaching is embodying Catholic social teaching is intrinsic to the mission of a Catholic institution of higher education. At the same time, those values and principles and virtues of the Catholic social tradition are echoed in other traditions. So it's not as though people who are not Catholic at our institutions find these principles alien.
Mhm.
You know, members of other faiths, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, any, most faiths have a deep concern for justice and the dignity of the human person. Likewise, secular human rights tradition. So I want to stress that overlap as well, if that makes sense. That there is commonality that we can find and share amongst ourselves, whether we're talking about Catholic students and Catholic faculty or members of other traditions or no faith tradition at all. So now to return to your question, this problem of corporatization and the larger milieu in which corporatization takes place, which is the neoliberal global order. Now we could have a really long conversation about that, obviously, but I do tend to talk about neoliberal corporatized universities because I think the two go hand in hand. I'll try to be succinct in speaking about this because I know this could be a, a, lengthy conversation. So, as I understand it, and my thinking is informed by, eminent historians of Catholic higher education like Alice Galen, David O'Brien, and others. Um, at a certain point, Catholic institutions became incorporated, right? And then and less run by their religious orders. Laypersons began to populate in greater proportions their boards of trustees. Those laypersons brought with them their expertise from the worlds of finance, the corporate sphere, etc. So that's part of the picture here. It's only one piece, but it's part of it. As Galen and others, Alice Galen and others maintained, and I would agree, Bill Byron, for example, the great Jesuit, who was president of several different Catholic universities, talks about this in an article that I cite in the book. Catholic institutions, as the control was ceded to lay persons from religious, there wasn't enough of an intentional effort to ensure that there was enough training for people who were coming to the universities in the Catholic social tradition and the Catholic tradition more broadly. So what's happening is folks are coming from the corporate world, the professions of law, and those are the professions that tend to predominate our boards to this day. They bring tremendous expertise from their fields, but they lack deep knowledge in the Catholic social tradition very often. Now, let me hasten to add, I don't want to make this, a sort of analysis that, pits the enlightened adherents of Catholic social teaching versus those who are ignorant of it, because the research that you and I are aware of, and I'm sure others in the audience are aware of, the vast majority of Catholics know very little about Catholic social teaching. So, many of our colleagues know very little. That's faculty colleagues know very little about Catholic social teaching. Many of our students, even if they come from Catholic backgrounds, know very little about Catholic social teaching. And so we have this kind of vacuum, if you will. And what fills the vacuum? Well, neoliberal ideology. The embrace of the anthropology of Homo economicus. This is something that I talk about in the book as well. So an understanding of the human person that sees the human person as primarily a rational self-interest maximizer, right? And so what part, I haven't yet talked about any practices of corporatization, but I'm very deliberately first foregrounding any discussion of those practices in a larger problem that I see, which is a distorted understanding of what it means to be a human person, one that conflicts with the social understanding of what it means to be a human person in Catholic thought, which again is not just particular to Catholic thought. It resembles Aristotle's notion of zoon politikon and many other understandings of a human being as a social creature that is meant to live in community, right? Our tradition tells us, the Christian tradition tells us, based on a Trinitarian understanding of the human person, we are created to love. We are created to be in mutual relationships of respect and love with one another. That's our very reason for being. And that's when we're most fully alive. That's what gives our lives meaning. I learned that, by the way, initially from my great Jesuit mentor at Georgetown, Father Otto Hentz. To be is to love is to be. He would often repeat. Back then, I don't know that I fully understood that, but now I think I understand it a little better at age 51. So you see where I'm going with this. If we come to the decision-making processes at the university, and again, it's not that we're all consciously aware or even consciously embrace this understanding of what it means to be human, but I think, and I locate myself in this conversation because I'm also guilty of putting myself above the common good at times, and I'll say more about that in just a second, how that might look. So we come to the decision-making process with a distorted understanding of what it means to be a human person, and that leads us to be more prone to accept these practices of corporatization. I'll just give you one example because I know we need to move on to other questions. I talk about this in the book, but I also talk about it in more detail in an article that I published, or a chapter that I published in an anthology called Working Alternatives. So the practice of RCM, or responsibility-centered management, I'm sure Father O'Brien is aware of it. You may be aware of it. Others on the in the webinar may be aware of as well. RCM, Responsibly Centered Management. David Kerp of UC Berkeley summarized it very nicely in a succinct way. Each tub on its own bottom. So each discrete unit at the university is responsible for being fiscally solvent for its own finances, right? This is what leads to what I think are distorted practices at our universities where, for example, a theology department, a math department, a fine arts department is expected to be revenue generating, right? And if it's not revenue generating, well, then it's going to count against the department in some way. And so this is why you have people talking about a multiversity versus a university, right? Very often, people will say, well, University X or University Y has a very large endowment, but that fact that a university has a very large endowment says very little about the finances of an individual unit in that university because of the way of a practice like responsibly centered management, which expects all units at the university to be financially independent. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to say is there's an anthropology going on here. Why? And then we have departments, Julie, competing with one another for students. So if my department has less students, less contact hours than another department, that's going to affect the finances of the department, right? And that's when I begin to say, what's going on here, and what's the understanding of what it means to be a university in a community that undergirds this type of practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so these
I know that was a lot.
Yeah, no, that it is. But these are things that have come into Catholic higher ed in the last, how many years?
20 years or so.
Yeah.
Program prioritization. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right. So programs that are not revenue generating, that are costing university, perhaps should be cut. And then what do we see? So we see at Catholic universities, fine arts departments being cut, foreign language departments being cut, theology departments maybe we shouldn't even talk about that, but how do you have a Catholic university without a theology department? Well, according to Ex Corde Ecclesiae, you don't, right? You can't. So let me stop there. Does that address the question of corporatization?
So it's an anthropology and understanding of what it means to be human, and also business models that have seeped their way in that are difficult to resist. Let me push the question a little bit. So I mean, I think sometimes when people hear ethicists talk, they're like, well, that it sounds nice, or we're striving for, it's an ideal that we strive for. But the realities on the ground are difficult. For instance, most of our Catholic universities are tuition dependent. So we would love to admit everyone without regard to financial need, but we simply can't. We would love to have greater diversity, but we can't. So how would you answer something like this? These are ideals, but you have to be realistic and live in the world.
Yeah, it's really important issue. And let me start by saying I'm very grateful for the job that I have. I'm fulfilling my vocation as a theologian, and I acknowledge and own my own privilege as a tenure track professor. I refer to tenure track privilege in my book. So I have the privilege of trying to speak about these issues honestly, from a place of privilege, which I acknowledge, and also from a place where I don't have to balance the books, right? That's not a part of my job description. So I don't envy the folks at our universities who have to manage the budgets and who have to, prioritize the finances. I acknowledge they have extremely difficult jobs. I want to say that up front. So I don't mean to malign anyone who's working in any part of the university in that regard. I don't envy you at all. And I know that there are very good people who are trying to, make this work in a way that's faithful to Catholic social teaching. So I often hear questions like, so Professor Beyer, you're asking us to pay all faculty, including contingent faculty, a just wage. Isn't that going to drive up the tuition, right? And aren't you at the same time arguing in your book, you have a whole chapter about greater access for students like yourself from economically disadvantaged backgrounds? And are these competing interests? Well, they can be. At the same time, I'd like to start by saying we have to have difficult and transparent conversations about the entire university budget first. In other words, I do try to push back against this notion, which I've encountered often enough, of pitting students against faculty. When students and faculty are, really at the heart of the university and its mission, learning and teaching, teaching and learning, right? What are the areas of the budget where perhaps there's a little bit of bloat that, should be addressed? We all know, I think it's not a secret, the exorbitant rise in expenditures on athletics. I talk quite a bit about this in my book. I say this as a former college athlete, someone who loves sports. At the same time, I think things have changed a lot since my days at Georgetown as an athlete. Looking at coaches' salaries, the overall expenditures on athletics, just ballooned. The rate of expenditure, I think it's twice, if not more, 2 times more than the expenditures on academics, right? So my point here being, Julie, and I'll refer to anyone who wants to delve into this to the work of someone who's much more astute and intelligent than I am, capable than I am, Steve Schulman, who's an economist of higher education at Colorado State. And he talks about in a really compelling article, in my view, that very often it's not that we lack the resources, it's that the resources are being diverted elsewhere. Mm. There are certainly cases where universities are struggling to keep their doors open. We should acknowledge that, of course. But and all the more so in the present moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all know the effects that it's had. Incidentally, my book was finished before the pandemic took hold, and so I understand that the budgetary challenges have gotten even greater than when I was doing my analysis. But hopefully you see where I'm going with this. In other words, yes, there are difficult trade-offs. At the end of the day, the framework I propose, and I think the framework that Catholic social teaching provides, is for us to talk about this in the language of human dignity and human rights and the common good, right? So when trade-offs need to be made, first and foremost, we need to prioritize fulfilling the human rights of all people. That means students, faculty, staff, all people on our campuses. So this is where we begin, maybe we can prioritize. We can begin to say, as I do in the book, does everyone who's making the salary that they're making really need, or should they make that salary? And again, I acknowledge myself in this regard. I say that at one point, perhaps the highest earners at the universities could take on what I call voluntary solidarity pay cuts of 10%. And those pay cuts could be graduated in accordance with the level of earnings. There should be a willingness of everyone on a campus, a Catholic campus, to engage in shared sacrifice and to look very closely and very hard at where legitimate sacrifices can be made. Another example, do faculty really need to go to 2 or 3 conferences every year? I know some faculty colleagues are going to really resent what I just said. I get that. But at the same time, I think it's very important for our own intellectual development, continue to challenge ourselves to grow as educators, as scholars. However, when there are people on our campuses who are making poverty wages, when there are students on our campuses who incur incredible amounts of debt, $50, $60, $70, $80, $90,000 for undergraduate education, their rights need to come first. This is also a matter of prioritizing the preferential option for the poor. So I acknowledge the difficulties here. I do think there are difficult trade-offs that need to happen. I also want to say, Julie, and I'll stop with this, but I do want to also go beyond the level of principle. There are some positive, intriguing examples of institutions that are really doing well in this regard. Let me, for example, just say a word about Franklin and Marshall. Franklin and Marshall here in Pennsylvania tripled the amount of Pell eligible students in 3 years. How did they do that? Well, you might say, well, you might speculate, well, they must have a really large endowment. They don't. Their endowment, at least when I cited it in the book, was under 400 million. That's a respectable endowment. It's not, we can't say it's because they have a $10 billion endowment or something, the endowment of size of University of Notre Dame. They had very bold leadership that decided they were going to prioritize this, and they did it. The president at the time, Dan Porterfeld, who used to be, as Father O'Brien knows, I'm sure, at Georgetown University, and the board of trustees decided we're going to make this happen. I'm sure if we looked deeper into the example, we might find some difficult trade-offs that had to happen, but it happened. So I could go on with other examples, and I try to hearken these kinds of examples in the book to say this can be done. In terms of Catholic institutions, I think of a place like St. Peter's College in New Jersey, Trinity Washington University in DC, Dominican University in Illinois. So there are places that are making things like this happen, greater access, for example. I'm going to stop just because I could keep going,
Yeah.
but let me stop and let you get in a word edgewise.
No, but it's so great to hear that there are examples of schools that are making these things happen. We need to know that there are possibilities, I think, to make these ideals helpful for our conversations. And I also appreciate you talking about the sacrifices that privileged faculty like ourselves may need to make, so that we're not just calling for money out of nowhere, but we're actually asking ourselves what we might need to give up. That to me makes this a particular, that might be a strength of the Catholic tradition that's calling us to that kind of sacrifice.
Yeah, if I could just to clarify so that nobody misunderstands, that I know some colleagues of mine will not be happy with me talking about voluntary solidarity pay cuts and locating tenured faculty among those that might need to take one when times are difficult. That must be predicated on an honest, open, transparent dialogue about the whole of the university's finances. In other words, asking folks to take voluntary, this is the way I argue at least, take those voluntary solidarity pay cuts must be truly they must be truly necessary. We should look for, we should try to minimize the amount of pain, the amount of harm that's done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not backtracking away from the idea, but I'm contextualizing a little bit more.
Sure, I want to be careful with that notion of sacrifice. I think that makes sense. I have a couple questions coming in, and I'd like to encourage others to ask questions. Let me first go to this one that came in from Aaron Bishop. You used at the beginning the word contradiction. We might also use the word tension. Would the tension between our ideals and what we're doing now, is tension a better way of moving into conversation and humility? Or would contradiction, why choose contradiction? Is it because it's more prophetic?
It's a great question. I think in some cases tension might be the more appropriate word. But I think I'm going to say that there are cases where contradiction is probably appropriate. The Catholic social tradition is very clear about certain human rights. We refer to them, the tradition refers to them as basic human rights, right? So among them are the right to a living wage, the right to work, the right to a living wage, the right to health care, the right to housing, the right to sustenance, nutrition. These are basic rights in the Catholic social tradition. Now, in the U.S. context, fulfillment or realization of these rights is largely dependent on the employment context, right? So we don't live in a society where we have a state-based healthcare system. It's an employer-based at the moment, or for the foreseeable future. It's an employer-based healthcare system. So the employer needs to do as much as possible to make this healthcare affordable. And if the employer is not doing as much, it could be a tension. Maybe this is a place where we have to start thinking about intention, what's really going on. And maybe I can clarify some things that I said earlier in this vein. Um, I think, Julie, when you asked me the question about how to actualize the fullness of Catholic social teaching given the budgetary challenges, I also want to say we should be trying to actualize them asymptotically. So to approach this justice, gradually, asymptotically. And the question then becomes, are we doing as a community, as a campus community, everything we can to actualize to instantiate the fullness of Catholic social teaching? If we are doing everything we can, then perhaps tension is the better word. But if there's really a way that we could be doing better and we simply have made choices otherwise, then I would refer to that as a contradiction. So as you know, as an ethicist, intention is key, right? I'm quoting one of my mentors, James Keenan, intention is key. I've heard him say that many, many times.
For sure. No, that's really helpful. A couple questions coming in there asking a little bit to clarify a little bit more about salary issues for contingent faculty. Yeah, especially here in the Bay Area, paying a living wage is an awful lot. So is your argument because we don't live in a society that has a strong safety net, as certainly as some European countries, et cetera, would that obligation falls on the employer fully to pay the just wage?
Well, ultimately, I would say, in our tradition, as you know, Julie, St. John Paul II refers to the direct and the indirect employer in Laborem Exercens, his encyclical on human labor. So the indirect employer, meaning every institution, every organization in society has an obligation to help make it possible for the rights of all workers to be realized, including the right to a living wage. So government should be doing what it can to help a living wage be possible. At the same time, it is ultimately the responsibility of the employer to pay a living wage. And again, notice what I just said a moment ago. If we take, for example, just abstract the conversation from a university for a moment, but hopefully the analogy will make sense. If we take a small business, a business that employs maybe 5 people, and I've heard this from friends who are small business owners that, I'd love to pay my employees a living wage. I'm trying to get there, but I can't right now. Well, then that's the key question. Are they trying? Are they doing everything possible? There is an acknowledgement in Catholic social teaching. We find it in Pius XI and Quadragesimo Anno that the state of the enterprise, whether it's a small business or a university, must be taken into account. It's one factor when we determine what's a just wage in a given context, right? But again, so I want to stress unambiguously that this whole conversation has to take place in the context of the way we're talking about a university, the way the university uses its resources, generally speaking, right? I know these are difficult conversations, but in the book, I have charts with data about salaries. The highest earners, and I'm sure it's not a secret that on a lot of campuses, the highest earners making 2 million, 3 million are athletics personnel, and then adjunct faculty who are making a couple $1,000s a course. In the Catholics, light of the Catholic social tradition, that's just not justifiable. We have to meet the basic needs and rights of all people first before we can justify paying wages like that. St. John the 23rd put it very clearly. Wages cannot be left to the dictates of the marketplace alone. I often get pushback when I say things like I just did about, well, that's not the way the market works. I know that. As did St. John the 23rd know that. But we have to do our best to try to bring the values and the principles of the tradition into the conversation and implement them.
We have a question here from Ann Skeet. What about the potential that colleges and universities will close? And is that even more a reality with the pandemic? And I want to connect that with Matt Gaudet's question as well. In this COVID moment, right? Do we have to really consider these possibilities?
Well, I think we do, of course. I mentioned that a short while ago that I wrote the book prior to the pandemic. I was aware that at the time, I think quite literally a handful of colleges close every year. That has certainly increased due to the pandemic. So I understand that, and that's why I said earlier, realizing some of the aspirations and objectives that I put forth in the book in light of Catholic social teaching are likely going to be that much harder for many institutions. I understand that. So the question is, when is it legitimate from the standpoint of the framework that I'm using here? What I want to say is, pandemic or not, the framework itself still holds. We should still try to apply the framework of Catholic social teaching to the particulars of each case. And so it may be the case that, I talked about approaching justice asymptotically. Well, approaching it is going to perhaps be slower during the pandemic or come to a screeching halt. But again, in a situation of genuine scarcity, and I want to stress that, and I acknowledge that there are universities that are facing such a situation. In a situation of genuine scarcity, where can people be asked to undertake legitimate shared sacrifice? A lot of us have incurred salary freezes. A lot of us have had our retirement benefits cut or partially cut. And I would argue that, again, the highest earners should be willing to take on those sacrifices first. Again, locating myself as a tenure track professor, maybe not among the very highest earners, but certainly among those that should be willing to make that sacrifice if it's truly necessary. So sure. At the same time, recognizing that there are universities that are really facing that challenge now and in a situation of genuine scarcity. But there's another side to this, and I want to say this carefully, and I don't mean to, anger anyone by saying this or, falsely accuse anyone. There's a saying that goes, never waste a good crisis. And I do think we have to be careful about this. This is why we need genuine, open, transparent conversation. Why can't more of the endowment be spent if a place has an endowment? Is it really necessary to keep endowment spent? And it may be. In some states, I've learned, frankly, in the last year or so, that some states have a cap on the amount of endowment spending that a university, a nonprofit, can engage in. So yes, to the problem of scarcity and real concern about universities closing at this moment, but asking ourselves the hard question: are we doing all that we can to help people realize their rights and protect their dignity? Or is there something more that we can be doing, even in the midst of this terrible crisis and situation?
There's a question from Serena Koskarov at Seattle University about about more of an outward focus. So do we have to, especially in this global environment, think about the responsibilities of Jesuit universities in the world? She's talking about the university, the UCA in Managua. I think about them being targeted right now by the government because they're speaking out. Isn't this one of the serious challenges facing Catholic universities?
Well, I hope that this, I thank you for the question. I hope that this doesn't sound curt, but what I'm arguing in the book is that Catholic and Jesuit Catholic universities, among them, have done a better job of promoting justice ad extra or beyond the walls of our institutions. I'm not saying that it's done perfectly, and there's always more work to be done in that regard. I do see this is the argument, one of the central arguments of the book, while our institutions often do a good job trying to imbue the world, as they should, with the values of the Catholic social tradition, they're doing less in that regard ad intra or intramurally within our walls. And so that's the, talk about attention, that's a tension that I find. I see that there's a lot of great work being done in this regard. And again, there's always more that could be done to imbue the world with the values of the gospel. But at the same time, and here I'll quote the 1971 Synod of Bishops document, Justitia in Mundo. Those who dare to speak about justice to the world first need to be just. You know, and I talk about this idea of justice at home or domestic justice. So in order to be able to be just beyond our walls, we have to first engage in just practices within our walls. And again, I just reiterate what I said, that I think by my lights, and I could be wrong, of course, I think that our institutions have done a better job outside of our institutions than within. Why? One reason I speculate is it's a lot easier to criticize racism out there or unjust wages out there, to look, rather than looking at ourselves in the mirror and seeing how we're part of the problem. We are also engaging in unjust practices within our walls, within our homes.
Yeah, so if we turn inward again, there are questions about Catholic social teaching and labor unions for lectures. I know this is a part of what you treat in your chapter on worker justice. So what can we say about Catholic social thought and unions? And I'm especially interested in connecting with your work, your dissertation work on solidarity movement in Poland.
So just generally Catholic social teaching and unions, or the university context as well?
Well, the question is in the university, but no, the question is actually just generally. Maybe we'll start there.
Generally, okay, so let's start there. You know, one of the things about the Catholic social tradition that I appreciate so much is this long-standing, as Father O'Brien mentioned at the outset, this long-standing tradition. It's a long-standing tradition that goes back at least 150 years of fervently supporting the rights of workers, including the right to unionize, the right to form unions. On a personal level, my father was an iron worker who was permanently disabled on the job. So I saw what abuse and exploitation looks like in the workplace up close. And when I started studying the Catholic social tradition and understanding that our church deeply cares about the well-being of all workers, the dignity of all workers, it really excited me, and I really felt good about the fact that the church, you know, we often say Catholic social teaching, you know, Julie, is the church's best kept secret, and that's unfortunate. When I started learning as a graduate student about Catholic social teachings, particularly on the rights and dignity of workers, including the right to unionize, you know, it really enlivened my faith in a really tangible way. So what does Catholic social teaching say about unions? That all workers have, I'll try to keep it short and simple, although I could say a lot more, that all workers have the right to form a union or not. It's their choice. You know, St. John Paul II talks about this in Laborem Exercens and elsewhere, that unions are an indispensable, this is a quote from Laborem Exercens, an indispensable element of social life, right, of promoting the common good. They're indispensable. Pope Francis more recently said there's no good society without a good union. Now, he also was saying it has to be a good union, right? No one is saying that unions are always perfect and that they're flawless, and they're not above critique. But at the same time, the tradition says two things. Why unions? Why are they necessary? One, they're a natural form of association in accordance with, Pope Leo XIII says, the dictates of human nature. It's part of what it means to be a human community of workers, to form this kind of association. John Paul says this kind of association is called a union. So there's no, that's, I want to, you know, sort of insert a footnote here. sometimes people try to say, well, you could talk about an association, you can talk about a union, they're synonymous in the Catholic social tradition. That's pretty clear in Labor Exercens number 20. So they're a natural form of association for workers. It's part of, workers have a natural law right to form unions. Also, there's an acknowledgement in the tradition that unions are necessary because of the imbalance of power between employers and employees. Right? This is part of their critique, and I really appreciate Catholic social thought in this regard because of its nuance and its avoidance of either or. It's not, you know, an uncritical embrace of capitalism and rejection of socialism. Right? There's critiques on both sides. So there's an acknowledgement that in a capitalist economy, there's always going to be an imbalance of power between the employer and the employee. And this can lead to, and it does in fact lead to, and I could quote lots of documents from church documents where there's very blunt, frank acknowledgement of exploitation by employers. And thus, unions are a way of redressing that imbalance, of giving voice to the voiceless. So again, you know, an indispensable element of social living. St. John Paul also says that unions are a necessary mouthpiece in the struggle for social justice. Finally, again, I'll stress the point that I made at the outset. The United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, in the document they created to deal with problems that were going on in Catholic hospitals around unionization, and were finally, I think, resolved in favor of saying, as the bishop stated in their document respecting just rights of workers, workers themselves have the right to decide whether they form a union or not. No employer, no bishop, no one else other than the workers themselves can abridge that right.
It's really clear. And
I think it is pretty clear in the tradition, actually. I mean, again, that's acknowledging that unions are not perfect, that they're not a panacea, they're not above critique, but the right resides to decide, the right to decide about a union or not, or which union, resides with the workers themselves.
Right. And, you know, this is something, as we're closing, I just want to say that I just appreciate about the tradition is that there's a clarity around principles and a long tradition of applying them, and yet there's a complexity that allows us to have conversation, but also critique. So even the things we uphold, we're also going to critique, because we're always trying to hold human dignity at the center. So I just want to, I know that we could keep talking. There are a lot more questions I couldn't get to, but I want to thank you for being here and with us at a time when we have a lot of difficult questions that we're facing, and they're ethical questions. And it seems to me really important that we as a community say that Catholic social thought will anchor those conversations, and they can anchor our agreements and our disagreements as we try to seek the truth together. And I appreciate that you're also acknowledging, though, that there's conflict in the tradition, and there's a place for that, that we can struggle sometimes on our way to the common good. So thanks so much for being with us, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this tough conversation.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you, and look forward to having these conversations on campuses. I hope you all are having these conversations on campuses. I think that's the most important thing, that we have these conversations, that we have them openly, in a spirit of charity, in a spirit of solidarity. We try to learn from one another, listen from one another. I think, unfortunately, at times, there's a lack of trust among folks on campuses, and we need to rebuild that trust. And that can only happen in dialogue and acknowledging, and I'll close with this, a point that one of my great heroes, the chaplain of the Solidarity movement, Father Józef Tischner, stated during the height of communist repression in 1981 in Poland. He said, solidarity acknowledges, a dialogue in solidarity acknowledges that none of us have a monopoly on the truth, that I can only fully understand the truth if I see it through your eyes, and you can only fully understand the truth if I see it through your eyes. And if we start with that premise, I think then maybe we can, have these conversations in the spirit of charity and solidarity. I understand they're difficult conversations, and sometimes tensions can run high, but hopefully we can come to a place where we can at least talk more about these difficult issues.
Thanks so much, everyone.
And I just want to thank Julie and Jerry for a great conversation and for being part of this event, and look forward to more conversations like this as we continue to move forward. So thank you to you both, and everyone have a great evening.